Well, thank you very much, Shirley. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar on what actual DFARS 7012, NIST 800-171, and early CMMC assessments look like. How are they conducted? What are the typical pitfalls and how to determine if you are well prepared for them? My name is Sanjeev Verma. I'm co-founder of Prevail, a company that builds end-to-end encrypted email and file sharing systems to protect CUI. And I'm honored to co-host this public-private event with the Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Virginia MEPs and NEO systems. What makes today's webinar truly special are the credentials and deep expertise of our speakers. Mr. Nicholas Del Rosso is the Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, aka DIBCAC, Director in the Defense Contract Management Agency, U.S. Department of Defense. In that capacity, Nick oversees the cybersecurity assessments of the Defense Industrial Base based on DFARS 7012 and 7020. These are typically NIST 800-171 assessments. He is himself a highly respected practitioner who has served as the team chief for the DIBCAC. In that capacity, he supervised a team which conducted cybersecurity assessments of the DIB. He has also supervised assessments that certify C3PAOs, or the organizations that will themselves conduct CMMC assessments. In short, he's arguably the DoD's top assessment official and widely recognized as a subject matter expert on cyber compliance. Mr. Del Rosso earned a Bachelor of Science in Computer Science from the University of Scranton and a Master of Science in Computer Science from Villanova University. Warm welcome, Nick. Our second presenter is Ms. Marcy Womack. She's a director in Shellman Incorporated's Federal Assessment Practice, overseeing both emerging CMMC assessments and the established FedRAMP assessment program. Marcy has also served as a 3PAO representative on the Federal Secure Cloud Advisory Committee. And Shellman, her company, is a leading CMMC and FedRAMP C3PAO, aka a third-party assessment organization. Marcy has over 10 years of information security experience across various industries and holds several key certifications, including CISSP, CISA, and is a certified CMMC professional and CMMC provisional certified assessor. Welcome, Marcy. So for today's webinar, we will have a question and answer format. And while we will cover the most asked questions by our audience, we encourage you to post any questions on your mind, and members of our team will capture the questions and respond later, including with input from either Nick or Marcy. So we're going to start our Q&A first with NIST 800-171 assessments, and I'm going to request Nick to lead that off. So Nick, first, start us off, if you would, with what is DIBCAC and what's your role within the organization?
All right, so DIBCAC stands for Defense Industrial Base Cybersecurity Assessment Center, and we serve under DCMA, so the Defense Contract Management Agency. And again, DCMA is under the DoD umbrella, so lots of acronyms. But when it comes down to it, what the DIBCAC does is to look at the defense contractors who hold critical unclassified information, and so that's your CUI, right? And we want to make sure that companies are protecting that controlled unclassified information. So I think from that perspective, right, we follow the 7012. The 7012 specifies that companies must adhere to the NIST SP 800-171 at a minimum, unless they're aware that that 171 standard is not sufficient protection. And so we just go out and perform the assessments on the selected companies that have the most critical of the control on classified information, and try to essentially ensure that the risk that the department faces is kind of managed appropriately.
And Nick, your role within the organization, tell us a little bit about your background and history and what do you currently do?
Sure. So I am the director for DIBCAC, and within DIBCAC, we have three different groups. We have Group A and B, and those are our assessment groups. And then we have business operations groups, which helps to ensure that the assessment engine continues to churn. And my responsibility is to provide oversight for the organization and essentially empower our folks from the top level down to the bottom level, that they each have a voice in helping to run the organization and ensure that we're all kind of pulling in the same direction to protect DoD information.
So Nick, most of the assessments that you conduct are, as we understand it, in support of DFARS 7012, which is a clause that exists in defense contracts. And as you mentioned, requires controlled and classified information to be protected using the controls of NIST 800-171. So we understand that there are two types of assessments. One is called a medium assessment, and the other is a DIBCAC high assessment. So tell us, first of all, for those in the audience not familiar with these, what are a medium and a high assessment? What are the differences between these two?
Sure. And so those are the two types that the DoD performs assessments of. And there's a third type called a basic, right? And that's the self-assessment performed by a company. And so the basic assessment, you perform the self-assessment and you enter your company's information into SPURS, and that makes you eligible to receive a contract from the department. With a medium assessment, kind of moving up that trust chain, medium is a documentation review. So we as DIBCAC or other DoD entities have the ability to perform the medium assessments. We'll contact a company, and typically we try to do it like in a 1 to 2 week time span. But we reach out to a company, request their system security plan and associated documentation. And we try to give them about a week's timeline because they should already have it prepared. When we receive that, we go through and make sure that they are addressing each of the requirements. But the key part in a medium from a company's perspective is not just to parrot the requirement, but tell how you're meeting that requirement. So if you're meeting it via administrative control, like talk about your administrative control or point to a particular policy that satisfies that requirement. If you're meeting a requirement via a technical control, talk about your technical implementation. A lot of the times what we see in a medium is that a company will say, we're doing this, right? But we can't give them credit for meeting it because they're not discussing how they're performing that requirement, just that they're doing it. And so that's probably the biggest piece of advice I can give when companies write their documentation is to actually describe what's being accomplished. Moving on to the high-level assessment, that's primarily conducted by DIBCAC. It's the over-the-shoulder on-site assessment. So, we still go through the documentation, but now there's that component of a discussion or a demonstration on how they're meeting that requirement. So we'll see what they write about that requirement, but then we ask them to show us how they're implementing it. So if it's a technical control, we'll ask them to demonstrate that technical control, to show us the settings, show us, if they have scan history or log history, to verify that what they're saying is being done is actually being done. And so that's what we call kind of that high confidence, which provides the department the best level of assurance that those requirements are being met.
So let's dig a little bit deeper, Nick, into how a DIB organization will go through a DIBCAC medium assessment. So could you describe the process that a DIB organization undergoes in a DIBCAC medium assessment? You already laid out the foundation that, there's a week to prepare. But if you don't mind, since many of the audience are not familiar with the thing, just give us a little bit more deeper color into DIBCAC medium assessment process.
Yeah. So from a DIBCAC medium perspective, the effort required by the company should be fairly minimal, right? Because, they should have their system security plan prepared ahead of time. So essentially, before we even contact the company, we go through a process on our side, work with our DCMA contracting officers, and get the appropriate contacts for the company. We look through their contract history, if there's any particular elements we want to focus on. But then we make contact, and like I said, we try to do it on a Monday, and get it to the right people in the company. And essentially, they'll receive an email that states something to the effect of, we're conducting this assessment. We're requesting your system security plan by Friday, because again, they should have that system security plan in place. And so, we'll answer any questions they have at that time. Now, once we receive their system security plan, we have a team that has a slot in the schedule assigned for that particular company. Typically, it's the following week, but sometimes it might be 2 weeks out. And so that team goes through and reviews all the documentation. There may be a couple clarifying questions that they ask, but I would say the level of involvement from the company's perspective is probably no more than half an hour to an hour. Now, maybe they have some internal procedures they have to go through before they release their system security plan to the government. But from the touch perspective, it's really just about pushing that documentation over or making it available for inspection.
So Nick, one assumes that organization has a well-documented system security plan, but we know that often that is not the case. So the next question is, what are the indicators that an organization is well prepared or not? Are weaknesses in preparation and documentation readily apparent to your team? And if so, how? And the purpose in asking this question is, again, to provide guidance to the companies to basically determine for themselves, hey, am I prepared? What are they looking for? So kindly give us some perspective on.
Yep. And I'll say, a lot of the times you can tell by looking at the documentation if a company's going to be prepared for an assessment. And, I will say a medium can sometimes be harder in certain ways than a high, because with a medium, it's solely based on documentation. A high, a trained assessor might be able to elicit some of the information they need to satisfy a requirement. But when we look through the documentation, what we see is sometimes, as I mentioned before, companies aren't going to talk about how they're satisfying a requirement. There are templates out there that are basically like a checkbox, implemented, not implemented, NA type of thing. And a lot of those templates don't really elicit the information that assessors look for. So it's literally, you're just checking a box and saying you've implemented the control. And so companies have to be careful and vet the sources that they get their information from. And I know for a lot of small companies, that's a challenge, right? Like, you may have an accountant that got tasked with being the compliance officer for this type of thing. They're probably not going to have that IT background. They're not going to have that cyber background. So they're going to try to find what templates make sense, but they may not know enough to pick this template versus that template, right? And so I think that's a challenge. And I think that's something that, the community and the government could definitely work on together and try to get, more information out. It's why we perform webinars such as this, to help spread information to different organizations and different crowds. And so, when we look through that documentation, that's your first indicator, right? When you're looking at a company that's going to do well, you're probably going to see one that has a good governance structure, one that has policies. And when I talk about policies, I'm talking about like high level policies saying like, we're going to steer the ship, or maybe we'll steer it this way. But a good policy doesn't get down into the nitty gritty, because a good policy, you're not going to change very often, right? And a good policy, your people should be able to remember because it's very short and to the point, right? And so I think when you see things like that, you get a really good sense that this organization understands what they need to do. When you see an organization that doesn't have the policies or doesn't have any procedures in place, then it's kind of an ad hoc environment, and you get the sense that things might be word of mouth. There might be different implementations based on who's doing it. So you start getting a higher level of concern. And I know if you have a 3 and 4 person company, right, you're going to have some level of institutional knowledge. You're probably not going to have everything documented, right? And that's a challenge, especially when you're looking at a compliance type of assessment, because we're here to assess how an organization is implementing the controls and how we can have confidence that they're going to keep those controls implemented across multiple years.
So I think the key takeaway also is the emphasis that you're placing on thoroughness of the system security plan and actually understanding and not just relying on sort of simple check the box kind of things, which can be readily apparent to an assessor as a weakness. Is that a fair summary?
I think so. And, I do want to point out that a good system security plan doesn't have to be 100 pages. Like if you have a 5-page system security plan, you cover all your bases. And, in that system security plan, you're pointing to other organizational policies or documentation. That's perfectly acceptable, because at the end of the day, if you already have this stuff that exists, you don't want to do a duplicate, because then maintaining it becomes harder. Now you have 2 things that could be out of sync, right? So, if you're just using it to create a pointer or some sort of linked list in your organization that, hey, we are doing these things, here's the reference to them, right? That's perfectly fine.
And I think that's again, but the overall package, even though the SSP may be fairly concise, it needs to be thorough in pointing to the other documents that essentially provide the evidence that they're undertaking what they're saying they are doing. So
right, yeah. So I think with the current 171 that is out there, what you see is as you go through the document, right, it has the NFO section, non-federal organizations, right, and that section has the assumption that organizations, have a robust set of documentation. It doesn't necessarily call that out as a requirement, but as you get into the 171 alpha, the assessment methodology and assessment guide, there's certain elements that require documentation. So if you don't have any, you're probably not going to pass an assessment. Now, and I'll put a plug in here for NIST. In the draft Rev 3, they have moved those NFOs into actual requirements now. So the -1s for the 853 are being proposed into the 171 Rev 3. So, if that's something you support or disagree with, I believe the public comment period may still be open. And I would encourage folks to, provide their comments to NIST.
So let's move on to the DIBCAC high assessments. Again, kindly describe to us the process in terms of the logistics, the duration. What should an organization that has been tapped for a high assessment expect?
Okay, so with a high assessment, predominantly the organizations that we assess probably have a pretty good indication that we're going to come look at them at some point, right? So they're handling some of the most critical DoD information. Now, we do inject some randomness into that to make sure that we cover the broad spectrum. But prior to the conducting of an assessment, we try to coordinate. The ideal time, right, is probably that 6 to 3 month out window, because when you coordinate that far in advance, it provides ample time to get the schedules, get the logistics, make sure that the contractor has the resources available at the time. And I think that, that is ideal, right? So we go through that pre-coordination process, and, we identify the scoping, have those discussions. We talk about the contracts that they have. When we come to do an assessment, we're probably going to key on a couple contracts in particular that we want to examine and make sure that those particular pieces are being protected, but not only being protected, but that acts as a sense of sampling of how your environments are structured. So when we talk about sampling, we want to make sure that you're doing things the same way across your enterprise if it's being conducted as an enterprise assessment. And again, some of the best companies that we've assessed from the enterprise perspective have a great governance, right? So you could be doing a different solution at different locations, but your governance is going to be looking at that the same way and ensuring that those areas, even though they're implemented differently based on requirements for each site, but that governance is controlling the aspects of that. So, that's a key. But we get through all that pre-coordination. So now we're roughly a week out from assessment. The company sends over their system security plan. Our folks do the pre-read on that. We may show up on site the following week, conduct the assessment either on site or as a hybrid type assessment. The actual assessment is, we plan on roughly a week for an enterprise. Our assessment team is 5 people. We have an assessment lead and then 4 lead assessors for their assigned areas. And generally speaking, I'll say the assessments probably go Monday through either Wednesday afternoon or Thursday afternoon, depending on how quickly things go. It's fairly rare that we get to Friday, but sometimes we do, right? And then post-assessment, the team goes back, works on the reports, prepares that, sends it in, and then a score gets uploaded and dispersed. And I noticed from one of the questions prior to starting, someone had a question on SPURS, and I did provide the email address. So if they want to send that question in, we'll get that looked at for them.
So these are pretty thorough on-site, assessments, and you've, I'm sure, as you will later talk about, conducted a lot of medium assessments. So when you look at the broad spectrum of companies that you have seen, what are the top challenges organizations undergoing a 800-171 assessment face? Key areas that you typically find as issues?
Well, I think the number one, everyone could probably guess, it's FIPS, right? The requirement is FIPS validated. And there is some potential changes in the 171 Rev 3 draft that is out there. But, that validation piece is probably the most challenging aspect, because there are commercial products out there that look like they're FIPS validated. They talk about being FIPS validated. But sometimes when you look into the technical details, that's only if you're running in FIPS mode in Windows, right? And sometimes flipping that bit in the setup could break an enterprise. So some organizations have a challenge running in that mode. Some of the other things we've seen, some of the biggest challenges are multi-factor, right? From an IT perspective, we could sit here and say, oh, it's easy, just do this with your phone or get this key. But from a small business perspective, sometimes it's a lot more challenging. Like when you don't have that IT person I talked about earlier, multi-factor can be a problem, right? You may not know how to set up a particular key and how to get that turned on for your operating system, or to sync something up with a phone for a one-time PIN. And so, you go off and look for solutions or someone that could implement it. So I think those are probably the top two that we've seen. As you start moving down, and I believe it's dcma.mil/DIBCAC, we do have the top 10 requirements that we see as other than satisfied. And I would encourage folks to take a look through that. But as you start going down, some of it gets to documentation. And as I talked about in the templates, like I know a lot of people want to check NA for certain things. Let's say wireless, right? And say we don't use wireless. But the best practice for that is to have a policy that says, we do not permit wireless. And so it's really applicable, but you're controlling it via an administrative control, right? And that kind of covers all the bases, because unless you're scanning for wireless and making sure that no one's doing it, you just can't mark NA and kind of leave it to the wild.
Well, thanks, Nick. So a great many companies, especially the smaller enterprises, feel A, they were unaware that these assessments occur, and B, that, well, it's not going to impact me because just I'm small. Could you share some idea, if you can, of the number of medium and high assessments that DIBCAC undertakes in a year and is expected to in coming years? And is a small company correct in assuming, these guys are not going to tap on me? Okay,
so I'll take the company perspective first, and then I'll come back to some of the numbers, right? From a smaller, medium company's perspective, when you look at it as the government, we only have so many people that can do assessments, but we have been working with the ecosystem to kind of free up some of our assessors to conduct more assessments. Doing things such as joint surveillance has had a marked impact on how many assessments we can conduct. But we're also looking at the different ways that we can influence the DIB. And we've done some studies based on the scores that have been in SPURS, trying to understand, are these companies reporting that they're at 100, 105, or the perfect 110? Are they really there? So we've spun up medium assessments because those are a lot quicker and could be done more frequently to look at that, right? Additionally, things that we're looking at, and it's funny we have this conversation now, but in the next month or so, we're looking at assessing how some primes are managing their subs and looking at that supply chain. So while it won't necessarily be a 171 assessment on the prime, it is more typical of a DCMA assessment that DCMA typically conducts on the contractors that it has cognizance over. So we can go to a contractor and say, you have this clause on your contract, it's mandatory flow down. Are you flowing it down? and how do you know that your subs are doing this, right? And from that, right, what we're looking to do is then perform targeted assessments on key subs in that supply chain, whether it's a medium or whether it's a high, to determine if those subs are being correctly managed by the prime, right? And I think what that's probably going to have the effect on is not only are primes going to start looking a little bit closer at their subs and trying to manage more accordingly, but I think subs are also going to have a different avenue that they feel they could be assessed from, whether it's from DIBCAC or whether it's from the prime, right? And so we've traditionally focused on companies that have had prime contracts with the government, but we are using our DCMA authorities to ensure that all contractors performing work for the DoD that are being exposed to CUI are being managed appropriately and are implementing the correct cybersecurity requirements. Now, coming back to some of the numbers, right? As I said, with a high assessment, you roughly have a team of 5, and it takes a week, right? With a medium, you could have 1 to 2 assessors for 1 to 2 days. And as I discussed earlier, through the joint surveillance program, working with C3PAOs that have come through the system, you get to a point where you could have 1 assessor for half a day with the working in conjunction with a C3PAO. And when you get to that level, that dramatically scales the amount of assessments that you're able to conduct.
That's that's an impressive number, and especially in the medium assessments, the fact that you can do a quick documentation check and the primes being able to look at it is certainly very different than the era which was in the 2017 to 2018. So thanks very much for sharing. So let's move on to some of the more detailed, questions, Nick. You receive a great many questions on 800 and CMMC assessment topics from both C3PAO assessors and DIB companies. Can you provide some updates that on some of the most frequent areas where your guidance and clarification is sought? And we also understand particularly one of those areas is FedRAMP equivalency, and that the DoD's updating standards for that. So could you provide a few key updates on the key topics and what's going on and what to expect going forward?
Sure. And so I'll start by saying we are preparing a assessment FAQ that we as the DIBCAC get asked questions on. And we hope to have that out soon on our website. And we're going to continually add to it, but we are going through kind of the process for that publication to get some common questions answered. I'll take the question on FedRAMP, and then I'll pull in one of the questions that are in that FAQ. In terms of FedRAMP, I think one of the things we're seeing from the DoD perspective, right, is that if you look at FAQ 115, it talks about equivalency, right? And the problem that we've seen is it's easy to say something's not equivalent. It's hard to say something's equivalent without a clear definition of what equivalent means, right? And so I think that's where we are currently at. And I know that DoD has been working on preparing guidance to that. And I hope that, that guidance is out soon. It looks to be on track. So I hope that there's some clear things that come out shortly from what I've seen. I can't really go into what may or may not be in it. But I think it'll provide kind of that equivalency definition. And I think that once that definition is kind of out there, you'll probably see, some companies going to meet that equivalency standard. And I think that will kind of break that log jam in that CSP market. I think the other one, I'll talk about one of the questions that are going to be in that FAQ. We've seen VDI, right, as a hot topic, right? And I think it's something that in some ways it's hard to address, in others it's fairly simple, right? So when we perform our assessments, what we look for is one that you can't transfer information from the host to the VDI that you're accessing. So if you could copy paste and put it on your local machine, that wouldn't be compliant. But if that's prohibited, if you can't print out locally on your network, and the key is you're following the VDI vendor's security implementation, then you're probably going to be okay on that VDI during an assessment, right? So at the high level, right, like VDI is permitted, while it's always preferred that it's on company equipment, I have not seen anything from a regulation perspective that says it absolutely must be, right? So, if you're following the standard implementation, you have some basic things such as AV, and the host is patched and updated, whether it's through a technical control or an administrative control, then that VDI solution is probably going to be compliant. So those are two of the areas we've been looking at in terms of questions that we get asked.
Nick, moving on to the role that you play at DIBCAC in CMMC assessments, we know that you certainly assess the assessors, which is the C3PAOs, and also participate in some joint assessments. Could you tell a little bit about your role there and any key updates that you wish to share based on your experience in assessing for CMMC?
Yeah, and so that CMMC thing is kind of that tightrope where from the department's perspective, we always want to be very careful on what we say, given the rulemaking. So in relations to CMMC, we do perform assessments on the C3PAOs, but I did want to clarify up the joint surveillance assessments a little bit. So they're not really CMMC assessments, they're 171 assessments, and they're being volunteered by the DIB or by the contractors, and the contractors partner or hire a C3PAO to help conduct that assessment. And then, our personnel are engaged throughout the course of that assessment to ensure that it meets the standards that we've been using. So at the end of the day, a contractor gets a score in spurs for that particular assessment.
And that's a very, kind of key aspect that I think you're clarifying, which is not widely understood, which is that, basically a CMMC, early assessment, and even as the rules stand today in rulemaking, is basically a NIST 800-171 assessment. It's the same criteria, and at the end, a score is put in the SPURS database. And we're going to talk to Marcy about that. I wanted to circle back, Nick, to the basic assessment that you spoke about. Mm-hmm. And I'm going to play a little bit of a devil's advocate. So I go and submit a score without paying much, attention to it, and kind of say, hey, Nick, I got 105. Is that a good enough strategy? I know it isn't, but I'm just playing devil's advocate over here.
Right. Yeah. So I would definitely caution against that strategy, right? And here's why. In the past, whether it's been a medium or a high, we have used kind of the contractual remedies in DCMA's toolbox. We call them a corrective action request, but essentially they're notification of a contractual noncompliance, right? And through that notification process, there's different remedies that a contracting officer can use to ensure that a contractor complies with the contract they signed up for. It could be something from withholding payment to more severe, up to and including a cancellation of contract. In addition to the contracting perspective, right? You also kind of have our partners that we've worked with on the cyber fraud task force, right? And so they're looking at it from, you know, whether it's civil or criminal perspective. Was their intent to defraud? You know, were these scores intentionally misrepresented? Was that misrepresentation to enable a company to get business from the government? So, you know, I think right now there is not a particular score that is pass or fail, like contract or no contract award. You know, every score is supposed to be looked at by a program office. And really that's just to have that discussion of, you know, can I give you this CUI? Do we need to do something to protect it further? And so I really encourage folks to have an accurate score. Now, that's not to say that all scores out there, even though they may be off from what they're actually assessed at, are intentional misrepresentations. And I think that comes down to, especially with some of the smaller contractors, do they understand these requirements enough to perform a self-assessment, right? Or should they be seeking external help to ensure that they're performing an assessment, you know, that's representation of their company?
I think that has been super helpful in terms of, I think, setting the groundwork and providing a very good understanding for defense contractors on what is required, what is acceptable versus not, and how you assess. So I'm going to now move over to questions for the future, which are related to CMMC. And Marcy, tell us the role that Shalman and you yourself play in today's sort of pre-assessments. I don't know what the right terminology is, and the role that you expect to play in the future.
Yeah, I appreciate that, and I appreciate everyone for joining today. So I'm a practice director with Shalman. So we're an authorized C3PAO. I oversee our assessment team and the assessments that we perform in the 171 space, and that can vary. You know, to carry on Nick's conversation, we're doing some of the joint surveillance assessments. We can perform other types of assessments against NIST 800-171 that are outside of that joint surveillance program. And then, of course, in the future, once rulemaking is complete, we'll actually be one of the organizations performing the CMMC certification assessments.
So Marcy, want to emphasize the similarities and differences between a DIBCAC high NIST 800-171 assessment and a CMMC assessment. Both of them deal with 800-171. Could you clarify for the audience, how are they similar and in what ways do they differ?
Yeah, no, definitely. So I will say that it's a little bit of a difficult question to answer because CMMC assessments aren't actively occurring. And so we're kind of looking into the crystal ball, I call it predicting the future, and what we expect to happen. There are still some details that are being worked out between the DoD and the Cyber AB who oversee, the program, in that in terms of like deliverables and the report documents and the formatting for all of that, what that looks like in the CMMC certification assessment. So that's still in progress and partially dependent on the rulemaking process. But I can tell you that we consider these joint surveillance assessments kind of like pseudo CMMC assessments. They are not CMMC assessments formally, but we expect the process to be very, very similar. So joint surveillance is like we approach it in a three-phased approach. And so with phase one, it's kind of a readiness review. We perform a security assessment plan. We want to make sure that organizations have to move forward in the process, have a high likelihood of success. And so if we see a lot of red flags that are saying, hey, maybe things aren't where they need to be, maybe the organization's not mature enough or the processes are not mature enough, then we'll put a pause on that just to ensure that we can circle back when they are ready. So we expect the same type of process in the CMMC workflow because that is modeled after the draft CMMC assessment process, or the CAP.
Marcy, one thing I did want to get some clarification was that what you are, checking for is basically the NIST 800-171, the 110 controls. which is what Nick's organization, the DIBCAC, checks for in its medium and high assessments. Is that correct?
Yeah, that is. So kind of in like the joint surveillance program, we are overseen by Nick's team at DIBCAC. And so they're involved in the assessment. But I like to say that it's the C3PAO's assessment. They're kind of running the show with the oversight of DoD and their input and collaboration. And then, of course, all of our work papers and our deliverables are then reviewed by DoD. And then they will also, so the DIBCAC team, in addition to the oversight, they actually look at some of those DFARS 7012 requirements, particularly C through G, that the C3PAO doesn't look at because they're not directly tied to those NIST 800-171 requirements. So that's some of that kind of like two-pronged approach within those joint surveillance assessments.
So Marcy, this is a segue. You mentioned DFARS 7012 C through G. Could you provide us some understanding of what is DFARS 7012 C through G?
Yeah, definitely. So there are certain requirements there that focus on cyber incident reporting, that focus on that the flow down requirements for NIST 800-171 to ensure that any subcontractors are getting the appropriate flow down requirements. And so those checks focus there to ensure that those are in place in the contracts, as well as the cyber incident reporting to ensure that if there are incidents, they're being reported to the appropriate organizations within that certain time frame designated.
So here's a question, both Marcy, for you and for Nick. So if an organization suffers a cyber attack, which may be commercially motivated, let's say that I'm a DIB organization, I do happen to handle CUI, and I have discovered, say, a ransomware attack. Does that invoke DFARS 7012 C through G incident reporting requirements? And if so, will DIBCAC and others look at it?
I would defer to Nick on this.
Yeah, and I'm going to say that, if you have a ransomware incident and, it's on the network that has your CUI, then you should definitely report it because it should be, in that clause. You have 72 hours from the point that you become aware of it. Now, with a ransomware, you're probably aware when it starts locking the computers, right? Now, sometimes it can exist in the network for a while before that happens. But at least by that point, you start seeing your computers locked and a ransom demanded. You should be going out and reporting that to DoD so that DoD can perform an assessment of what could be compromised and do we have a concern, or is it targeting a specific sector or specific contractors. So absolutely, if that occurs, report it. Now, if it occurs on a business system that's not connected to anything that has your CUI, you can still report it if you want, but it's at that point, because there's that disconnect between systems, I don't believe it's going to be a mandatory reporting requirement for that particular scenario.
Well, thank you. So back to the CMMC world, for SMB, what will a CMMC assessment look like, Marcy? And for a large enterprise, and again, I understand that these aren't real CMMC requirements, but say from your vantage point, a NIST 800-171 assessment for an SMB versus a large enterprise, could you give us some color for
Sure.
what these two should expect?
Yeah, definitely. So when we're looking at small and medium businesses, usually the assessment scope is smaller because a lot of times large organizations, we may do an organization-wide, scope and assessment, or it may be on certain enclaves, and maybe we're assessing 3 different enclaves. But oftentimes for small businesses, it's probably going to be organization-wide. And depending on the size, the scope can be pretty small. And so we expect the level of effort to be lower than a large enterprise, as well as to really probably be sitting in the room or on virtual meetings with a smaller number of individuals, because a lot of times people wear multiple hats in those scenarios. And so our goal is to get in, get out, make the best use of everyone's time, but the requirements are the requirements. So we're still going to assess to the same degree and the same level as we typically would. It just may vary in terms of level of effort and timing on the level of complexity, the number of of systems in scope, and the personnel and perhaps MSPs that have to be brought in that process for a small business.
So Marcy, just a follow-up question. You mentioned, enclaves versus the entire enterprise being assessed. Would you say that for an SMB, an enclave approach offers certain, approaches to simplify, their compliance and to be more targeted in protecting their CUI?
Yeah, I would say it's give and take, to be honest, and for two reasons. So in terms of simplification and cost, I think that can help because oftentimes you may be applying more rigorous or stringent controls and requirements on a smaller number of systems. So perhaps the licensing costs are smaller in that instance, but you may need another person to manage that enclave or be responsible for it. But in terms of scope, it often does reduce the scope if we're looking at just an enclave because it's only the necessary systems, only the necessary network devices, network protection, all of that we're dealing with per the 110 requirements.
Marcy, moving on to the most important documents that a company needs to present for assessment. Nick gave a very good answer, but I often believe that repetition never spoils the prayer. So from your vantage point, could you again, reiterate what are the documents that a company that will go through a CMMC assessment should be prepared with, and what constitutes good versus insufficient for these documents?
For sure. So I always say, I'm an assessor, I'm an auditor at heart. It makes me happy, which is, I know, a nerdy thing to say, but to make your auditors' lives easier is always the best thing to do. And it also helps the organization. So I'm going to differ a little bit from Nick and say that a really detailed SSP is very helpful. And not just one that addresses the high-level controls, but also addresses all of those assessment objectives, because that's what your assessor is going to be looking at. I like to say it's an open book test. So in addition to those 110 controls and requirements, there are 320 assessment objectives that we're going to be looking at. So if your SSP is very detailed in saying, here's exactly how we implement this particular control, including parts A, B, and C that are included in the assessment objectives, it's going to make the assessment go a lot smoother because we can read the information, we can validate it in interviews and ensure that that's what we're also seeing in the evidence and in the demonstrations that we have. So strong SSP, including diagrams, so like architecture, as well as data flow, focusing on CUI so we understand how CUI flows throughout that organization or enclave, whatever the scope is, are all very, very key. And then I love to talk about policies and procedures because I know they're in the NFO controls, they won't be forever, but if you look at the assessment objectives, you can see how policies and procedures are baked into the objectives. So you'll see things like ensure blank is documented, ensure blank is identified. We're going to look at the SSP and we're going to look at supporting policies and procedures to satisfy that assessment objective in our testing. So I think that those are the big focus areas, and just to reiterate everything that Nick said essentially.
Marcy, again, from your vantage point, Nick articulated FIPS encryption and two-factor as the key areas that many companies struggle with. In your judgment, in addition to those, what are some other areas that you typically see as requiring attention?
Yeah, those are certainly the most prominent, and particularly for MFA, if you think about all the different access paths, as well as emergency access. And if someone loses their existing token, what happens in that scenario? Do you turn MFA off or what have you? So think about those as well. But the last thing I would say is the control of CUI and how maybe you've got paper or printed CUI. What are the controls when someone walks out of the building with that? Is it tracked? Is there some sort of log? Is it protected? So some of those media protection controls, we often get stuck on and have a lot of interesting heated discussions on, friendly discussions, but that's the other area in addition to the crypto and MFA areas.
So I'm coming down to the conclusion of this fascinating conversation. Nick, I have one question for you, which is, some perceive that this is an assessment and it's some sort of a check the box, and a situation arises where, I'm just kind of following the letter. I'm not really protecting the CUI as it should be, but it kind of meets the requirements. What's your perspective on real security versus just sort of check the box compliance? Does it matter from a assessment perspective?
Yeah, and so, that's a great question. I think when you look through the requirements and you kind of put your contracting hat on and look through the lens of contracting officers, lawyers, right? And you follow it, you're looking at how the requirement's written, what does it say I have to do? And more importantly, what trade space does it allow me to have as I implement a solution? So, when you look at, does an organization set a minimum password length or something like that? It doesn't tell you like, hey, a 3-character password isn't good, right? Like, don't do that. So you may have a company that says, okay, we're going to set it to 3 or 5 characters and call it a day. But then when you look into the DFARS clause, there's another one that talks about adequate security, right? And essentially what that describes is, look, if a reasonable practitioner would know that what you're doing is not right, then you should not be doing that, right? So I think it's clear to make a case that a 3 or 5-character password, even if an IT system lets you set it to that, which some don't anymore, from the government's perspective, it's an easy argument to make that, look, like this one's really clear that you can't do that. Like that's not even a non-best practice. Like that's actively called out as something you should not be doing, right? And so, I know there's a lot of discussion on what's good enough for this requirement. But at the end of the day, like that's what you fall back on when you're looking through these, is that adequate security to help you make that determination on, is what's being implemented good enough from a practical standpoint.
And my very last question, Nick, is, many in the DIB are saying, hey, let's see what's happening with CMMC. And so let's kick the can down the road and not do anything for DFARS and wait for CMMC to happen. And some perceive that to be a prudent approach. Is it a prudent approach? What's your guidance on that?
Yeah, and so, there's a couple parts, right? Like, so number one, 7012 is probably on your contractor being flowed down to you, right? So by you submitting that bid, you're attesting to the government that you're doing these requirements. And these requirements are currently the same ones in CMMC. So, if you're doing them for 7012, you should be doing them for CMMC. If you're attesting to the government that you're doing them and you're actually not and trying to kick the can down the road, strongly discourage that, because while, maybe we don't catch everyone that's doing that, are you going to be the one that we catch? And are the penalties from that and potential risk to your business, cheaper than actually implementing the requirements in the first place? I would probably say no, but I think that's a determination each company has to make. From the government's perspective, we are doing our best to ensure that we are looking at that compliance and trying to kind of filter the field and identify those companies which are attesting to doing requirements, but actually have no intention of doing them.
Well, thank you so much. It's been super helpful, I believe, to me, certainly listening to your comments, and I hope to the audience as well. Thank you very much, Nick, for participating. Thank you so much, Marcy, for participating, and to the audience for joining. And again, if you have any questions, please keep piling them up in the Q&A and in the chat, and we will respond to that. With that, we bring this webinar to a conclusion. Thank you all.